When I saw Venezuela's acting leadership suddenly pivot from defiance to calls for cooperation and peace, I didn't hear diplomacy. I heard headed pressure. Intelligence officers are trained to listen not for tone, but for cause. States do not reverse posture overnight unless the strategic environment around them has changed decisively. Public messaging is the last thing to move, not the first. When it moves quickly, something behind the curtain has already snapped. In this case, the change was not subtle. One day, the rhetoric was hostile, nationalist, and confrontational. The next, the same leadership was inviting collaboration within international law, invoking coexistence, and warning against war. That is not evolution, that is compression. I've watched this pattern repeat for decades. Leaders do not suddenly discover moderation after years of ideological rigidity. They discover vulnerability. The intelligence question is never why the words changed. The question is what leverage was applied to make resistance irrational. In Venezuela's case, the timing matters. The rhetorical reversal coincided with unmistakable signals that control over outcomes had shifted externally when senior U.S. officials openly state that American interests will be enforced and that rules will be set accordingly. That is not diplomatic ambiguity. That is dominant signaling. When a leader responds not with protest but with conciliation, it tells me their internal risk calculations have collapsed. The public explanation offered is peace. The real explanation is exposure. Legal, financial, and intelligence constraints have a way of converging suddenly. Acting leaders inherit not only authority, but also the unresolved liabilities of the regime they represent. When those liabilities become personal rather than abstract, behavior changes fast. Calls for dialogue are often the first refuge of leadership that understands time is no longer on its side. I have seen this in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. The script never varies. What sealed my assessment was the language itself. It was careful, lawyered, and calibrated to international norms rather than domestic defiance. That tells me the audience was not Venezuelans, it was Washington. Intelligence officers recognize this immediately because we've written these talking points ourselves for assets under pressure. This wasn't outreach, it was acknowledgement. The shift confirms that the strategic balance had already been decided elsewhere, and the acting leadership understood resistance would only worsen the outcome. The lesson here is simple and brutal. When power realities become undeniable, narrative collapses follow, and they happen fast. 34 auto-generate, acting pre-fins. Would you like me to continue with Section 2, Power Without Illusions? When leadership changes under duress, intelligence professionals strip away ceremony and look for command reality. Titles are noise, control is signal. Acting authority, especially in a crisis state, is rarely sovereign. It is conditional, borrowed, and monitored. I learned early in my career that the first question after any transition is not who speaks, but who can say no. In Venezuela's case, the answer became obvious the moment the rhetoric softened. Real power had migrated outside the formal chain of command, and the new public posture reflected that fact. Leaders who possess autonomy do not preemptively concede jurisdictional language or invoke international law as a shield. They do so only when they recognize that enforcement mechanisms have already been activated. This is where media narratives consistently fail. They report statements as if statements create reality. Intelligence officers know the inverse is true. Reality forces statements. The sudden embrace of coexistence and cooperation is not an olive branch, it is a status report. It tells adversaries and partners alike that the margin for maneuver has collapsed. When external actors demonstrate the capacity to impose outcomes through legal exposure, financial isolation, intelligence penetration, or credible force, the local leadership's job becomes damage control. That does not require orders. It requires understanding. In transitions like this, acting leaders are often selected not for strength, but for manageability. They are chosen because they can absorb pressure without fracturing the system further. That makes them uniquely sensitive to leverage. Unlike entrenched figures, they lack independent power bases, loyal security architectures, and ideological legitimacy. Every decision is provisional, every word is vetted. When they speak of peace, they are speaking to the custodians of their survival, not to their domestic audience. I have watched this dynamic unfold repeatedly. The outward posture moderates while internal controls tighten, buying time and reducing the probability of escalation. What matters is that the new tone aligns with the interests of the actor capable of enforcing consequences. That alignment is not coincidence, it is recognition. Once enforcement credibility is restored, whether through arrests, indictments, sanctions, enforcement, or demonstrated operational reach, the calculus changes overnight. Resistance becomes symbolic and therefore expensive. Compliance becomes rational and therefore immediate. This is the moment when illusions dissolve. The acting leadership understands that slogans will not stop extraditions, that speeches will not reverse financial freezes, and that defiance will not shield them from intelligence already collected. The hard lesson intelligence teaches is unsentimental. Power does not need to announce itself twice. When it does so once and is believed, the conversation shifts from ideology to survival. That is what happened here. The tone changed because the balance of power was clarified, not because anyone discovered a newfound commitment to peace. Would you like me to continue with Section 3, the intelligence pressure points? Every rapid political reversal is the product of converging pressure, not persuasion. Intelligence services understand leverage as a system, not a single tool. When posture collapses, it is because multiple pressure points have been activated simultaneously, leaving no safe axis of resistance. In Venezuela's case, the signals point to a familiar convergence: legal exposure, financial constriction, intelligence penetration, and the credible demonstration that operational reach is no longer theoretical. No single measure forces compliance. It is the realization that all exits are closing at once. Legal pressure is often the first invisible trigger. Indictments, sealed charges, and extradition pathways change how leaders think about time. When legal jeopardy moves from abstract threat to executable process, behavior shifts immediately. Acting leaders are acutely sensitive to this because they lack the institutional insulation enjoyed by entrenched figures. They know that immunity is political, not permanent, and that once international cooperation frameworks are activated, escape options narrow fast. The moment legal systems synchronize across borders, defiance stops being symbolic and starts being suicidal. Financial pressure follows closely behind. Regimes can tolerate sanctions when enforcement is porous. They cannot tolerate them when compliance is monitored, intermediaries are named, and assets are traced in real time. Intelligence-driven financial warfare does not announce itself publicly, but its effects are immediate inside elite circles. When access to liquidity, travel, and personal security funding is threatened, rhetoric softens. Calls for peace are often preceded by frantic internal audits and asset reviews. I have seen this pattern too many times to mistake it for diplomacy. The most decisive pressure point, however, is intelligence exposure itself. When leadership understands that its communications, movements, and contingency plans are already known, strategic bravado evaporates. Penetration does not need to be proven publicly, it only needs to be believed privately. Once that belief sets in, leaders begin speaking as if restraint were their idea. That is not coincidence. That is containment without occupation. What outsiders miss is how quickly these pressures compound. Legal risk accelerates financial panic. Financial panic magnifies intelligence vulnerability. Intelligence vulnerability collapses political confidence. By the time the public hears conciliatory language, the decision has already been made. The speech is merely notification. The hard lesson is this: states do not de-escalate because they are convinced. They do so because resistance has become strategically irrational. When intelligence pressure points align, tone is the first casualty, not the last. Would you like me to continue with Section 4, the myth of voluntary de-escalation? One of the most persistent failures in Western reporting is the belief that de-escalation is a choice freely made by rational actors seeking peace. Intelligence officers know better. Voluntary de-escalation is a myth sustained by narrative convenience. States do not walk away from confrontational postures because they are persuaded by norms or language. They do so because the costs of maintaining those postures have become unsustainable. When officials suddenly speak of dialogue and coexistence, it is rarely a moral awakening. It is an admission that the strategic environment has turned hostile to their interests. The myth survives because it flatters everyone involved. Media outlets get a hopeful storyline, policymakers get to claim diplomatic success, the affected leadership gets a face-saving exit, but none of this reflects causality. Intelligence analysis is not interested in intentions stated after the fact. It is interested in constraints imposed before the shift occurs. In Venezuela's case, the timing of the rhetorical moderation did not follow negotiations or concessions. It followed unmistakable signals that enforcement mechanisms were already in motion. That is not diplomacy producing peace, that is power producing compliance. I have watched this narrative inversion play out repeatedly. When leaders are pressured into submission, they are allowed to reframe compulsion as cooperation. This is not generosity, it is utility. Allowing a pressured actor to describe retreat as statesmanship reduces the risk of unpredictable escalation. Intelligence services often tolerate this fiction because it stabilizes outcomes, but analysts must never confuse the story told to the public with the reality driving behavior. The story is theater, the reality is arithmetic. What exposes the myth most clearly is consistency. If de-escalation were truly voluntary, we would see reciprocal gestures, confidence-building measures, and negotiated sequencing. Instead, we see unilateral tone changes paired with silence on substance. That silence is telling. It reflects the absence of bargaining power. Leaders who retain leverage negotiate. Leaders who lose it appeal. Appeals to peace are the language of constraint, not choice. The danger of believing the myth is strategic blindness. When policymakers accept the narrative of voluntary moderation, they underestimate the fragility of the situation. They assume goodwill where there is only calculation. That leads to complacency, premature concessions, and misread signals. Intelligence history is littered with cases where this misunderstanding produced renewed instability because the underlying power imbalance was never acknowledged openly. The hard lesson is uncomfortable but necessary. De-escalation that follows pressure is not reconciliation, it is submission dressed in diplomatic language. Pretending otherwise may soothe audiences, but it corrupts analysis. And corrupted analysis is how strategic surprises are born. Would you like me to continue with Section 5, Precedent Cases Intelligence Never Forgets? Intelligence professionals are trained to think comparatively because history is the most reliable warning system we have. When I saw Venezuela's acting leadership reverse tone, my mind went immediately to precedent cases where interim figures discovered that inherited authority did not include immunity. The pattern is old and it is unforgiving. Transitional leaders often believe they can recalibrate rhetoric without recalibrating reality. They are wrong. Intelligence services remember how these episodes end, even when the public does not. I think first of moments when successors attempted to soften posture after decisive external action had already occurred. In each case, the shift was framed as pragmatism, but it was driven by exposure. Once enforcement credibility is demonstrated through arrests, prosecutions, or undeniable operational reach, the successors' options narrow dramatically. They are no longer negotiating from a position of uncertainty. They are managing the consequences of decisions already made by others. History shows that this is when leaders begin speaking the language of international law and peace, not because it offers protection, but because it is the only language left. What intelligence never forgets is how often these transitions fail to restore sovereignty. Interim moderation does not reverse leverage, it merely pauses escalation. The external actor retains the initiative, and the local leadership adjusts behavior accordingly. In several well-documented cases across Latin America and Eastern Europe, acting leaders attempted rhetorical resets only to discover that cooperation did not restore autonomy. It delayed reckoning, but it did not erase it. The intelligence lesson is blunt. Once a regime's vulnerability is exposed, Tone changes do not close the file. Another recurring feature of these precedents is internal fragmentation. Acting leaders face pressure not only from outside, but from within. Security services, party elites, and economic actors begin hedging once they sense that protection is no longer guaranteed. That internal drift accelerates compliance. When elites stop believing the state can shield them, they push leadership toward accommodation. Public calls for peace often mask intense private panic. Intelligence officers recognize this dynamic because it produces the same indicators every time: tightened messaging, reduced public appearances, and an obsession with legal language. These cases teach a hard lesson that analysts must internalize. Strategic reversals are rarely about persuasion, they are about inevitability. Once inevitability is perceived, resistance becomes symbolic and therefore pointless. That is why precedent matters. It strips away hope and replaces it with probability. And probability, not optimism, is what governs intelligence judgment. Would you like me to continue with section VI, strategic consequences for the hemisphere? When a leadership reversal happens this abruptly, the consequences ripple far beyond the country in question. Intelligence officers immediately widen the aperture because regional actors are always watching for signals about enforcement credibility. Venezuela's shift did not occur in isolation. It recalibrated expectations across the hemisphere about what defiance costs and what compliance buys. The most important consequence is not diplomatic language. It is deterrence restoration. Once it becomes clear that rhetoric will not shield leaders from legal, financial, or operational consequences, other governments quietly adjust their own risk calculations. For years, U.S. credibility in the region eroded not because of lack of capability, but because of inconsistent follow through. Intelligence assessments repeatedly warned that selective enforcement invited testing behavior. States learned they could posture publicly while assuming consequences would be delayed, diluted, or politicized. When that assumption collapses, behavior changes quickly. The Venezuelan episode sent a signal that enforcement mechanisms were no longer abstract. They were executable. That signal travels faster than any press release. Another consequence is internal alignment. Regional governments that had hedged between confrontation and accommodation now face clearer incentives. Cooperation becomes safer when enforcement is predictable. Defiance becomes costlier when exposure is real. This does not produce loyalty. It produces compliance. Intelligence professionals do not confuse the two, but compliance is sufficient to stabilize environments and reduce escalation risks. That is why these episodes matter strategically. They reshape behavior without requiring overt force. There is also a cautionary consequence for Washington itself. Restored credibility raises expectations. Once power is demonstrated and believed, failure to sustain consistency invites renewed challenges. Intelligence history shows that deterrence is not a one-time achievement. It is a condition that must be maintained. If enforcement wavers after initial success, the backlash is sharper because actors feel misled rather than merely unconvinced. That is the strategic risk that follows any decisive action. Finally, the hemispheric lesson is institutional. Intelligence-driven outcomes expose the limits of narrative management. Allies and adversaries alike learn that messaging cannot override material constraints. That realization reshapes diplomatic engagement. Conversations become more transactional, less theatrical. That is not idealism, but it is stability. The region adjusts not because it believes in American rhetoric, but because it respects American capability when it is applied coherently. That distinction matters. It is the difference between influence and illusion. Would you like me to continue with Section 7, the final intelligence lesson? The final lesson intelligence teaches in moments like this is uncomfortable because it strips away comforting myths. Strategic narratives do not collapse because they are challenged rhetorically. They collapse when reality intrudes and cannot be edited out. What happened in Venezuela was not a failure of messaging or a triumph of diplomacy. It was the exposure of a long-running fiction that posture could substitute for power and that narrative management could outpace enforcement indefinitely. Once that fiction failed, everything built on top of it failed as well. I have spent my career watching institutions lie first to the public and then, more dangerously, to themselves. When intelligence becomes a servant of narrative rather than a check on it, decision makers lose the ability to distinguish belief from capability. That is how strategic delusions form. Leaders begin to assume that words deter, that statements signal resolve, and that time will somehow soften consequences. Venezuela's sudden tonal reversal is a case study in what happens when those assumptions collide with operational reality. The shift did not reflect a new worldview, it reflected the end of denial. The deeper warning is not about Venezuela, it is about the system that allowed narrative to replace assessment for so long. Intelligence failures are rarely about missing information. They are about ignoring information that contradicts preferred stories. When enforcement credibility finally returns, it feels abrupt because it has been absent for so long. The shock is not the action itself, but the realization that action was always possible. That realization forces recalibration everywhere, from regional capitals to domestic institutions that had grown comfortable with symbolic policy. The hard intelligence lesson is this: credibility is cumulative, but so is decay. Once credibility erodes, restoring it requires decisive, often disruptive moves. Those moves expose how hollow previous narratives had become. That exposure is destabilizing, but it is also clarifying. It reminds actors that power operates whether acknowledged or not, and that pretending otherwise only delays reckoning. When intelligence professionals say that reality always wins, this is what we mean. In the end, the collapse of the American strategic narrative did not occur because adversaries were clever. It occurred because institutions chose fiction over friction. Venezuela's abrupt change in tone is not a mystery. It is a signal flare marking the moment when fiction finally met force. Intelligence does not celebrate that moment. It records it, learns from it, and warns what happens when the next narrative begins to drift from reality again.